We are continuing our look at the book of James. We are at the very end of chapter 1. This is that section that talks about true and undefiled religion. I had hoped to deal with this with the previous passage, but there's just a lot of material here. And as I was saying last time, there's many things that are in this text that are so applicable to all time, but particularly the age and time that we find ourselves here amid the protests and the rioting in the aftermath of the obvious murder of George Floyd, and all these discussions about race and systemic racism, and as well as protests and riots against the police and controversy. And I don't want to get into all of that as far as trying to make this only a relevant topic for now, but it does so happen that this text, as expositional preaching often does, you end up being in the passage that is speaking directly to these events. And so I commented last time and said that we need to listen carefully to what James tells us, to be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. And I mentioned that there are some practical ways that we should do this, and increasingly such as our lives are more and more and more defined by what we do on social media, Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and so on, and how we are forced or coerced in some ways, or do of so of our own volition, to make these proclamations of politics and purpose statements that are just part of what we do now. And I would just like to say that that's an important part. We need to definitely consider what we're going to do on these platforms, and given the responsibility that we have as believers in Jesus, that we need to be salt and light to those around us. We need to obviously be proponents and advocates of those who are harmed, of those who are being treated unjustly. But there's another aspect in which we need to stop and think that never in the history of the world have we faced such circumstances. And you might say, what are you talking about? Well, it's a fairly recent event, a fairly recent development, that what we're able to do in terms of having our public policy blared out to a megaphone to all of those who are our friends on Facebook and anyone who else might share us, or again, Twitter, Instagram, whatever you use. This is not something that's been around for a long time. It used to be that you had to get on the internet and do some other things, or even before that, you wrote a book or editorial. Now anyone can simply say what they like. Now, this has, of course, pros, and this has, of course, cons to it. It allows a message to grow, and it also allows other dissenting messages to attack that message and lead into all kinds of discussions. And so I'm not, again, commenting on or even criticizing any one particular thing that people are doing. I'm just wanting us as Christians to listen closely to the language that James speaks to his commands, to be, again, slow to speak, slow to anger, quick to listen. We are, again, quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger. That is so critical. And this is such an important part of what James is arguing for. We need to listen. We need to pay careful attention. We need to think through these issues carefully and critically, and be led by the Spirit, be led by His Word to think through how the Lord would have us to act in these situations. And sometimes that's not saying anything. That's waiting, not sharing that meme or that post that seems to fit all of the check boxes that you already feel in your soul, in your heart. It's waiting to understand and know what is right before we speak. But it's also not being willing to speak up and be an advocate for what you do believe. And so this is just a call to be sincere, a call to also to be patient and to to use godly wisdom, which is really, again, what this book of James is all about. And so last time we looked at how we should be, again, quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger, and he moved through this step by step, discussing some different aspects of what true religion is defined as, and that's leading us up to this point, where we're going to have this almost like a purpose statement for James, this true and unbridled religion. And so with that, let me go ahead and share my screen with you, and then we can see some of what I prepared for our time together. So I'm going to go ahead and read our text. If anyone thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his heart, this person's religion is worthless. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstained from the world. James 1, 26 through 27. Now, the first thing I'd say is that when we encounter some statements about religion in the Bible, we might think that this is actually kind of normal, but it's actually quite not normal. We don't actually have the word religion occurring all that much in either the New Testament or the Old Testament. It just doesn't occur that much. And there's a reason, there's somewhat of a reason for that. The first reason I would say is because most of the people that lived in or really all of ancient Israel was religious. Now, we might say that they were, like in the Old Testament and in different places, even sometime in the New Testament, we have references to them having bad practices, or in the Old Testament falling after other gods, or syncretism where they worship God alongside other pagan deities. But no one is discounting that they're religious. There are no atheists in the ancient world. Everyone is a theist. Everyone believes in gods and in a theistic worldview. What's so revolutionary about the biblical worldview is that it's monotheistic. It's that there's one supreme God that is Lord and creator of all. And so that's one reason why perhaps we don't have references to it. And another thing that's just kind of an aside to this, it's important that we understand what we mean when we say religion. I am peeved to some extent by those who would say that Christianity is not a religion, it's about a relationship. That is a nonsensical statement. It really is not defining what you mean at all. It's saying that it's totally just changing the topics. If Christianity is not a religion, the word is meaningless, because the dominant world religion that we live in currently and has been for the last 1,500 years or so is Christianity. Whether it's talking about Catholicism or Orthodoxy or later Protestantism. So it is religion and Christianity, they're related. Just as Judaism is a religion, just as Islam is a religion, Christianity is a religion. Now, when you talk about, when you're trying to say that Christianity is not about religion, it's a relationship, you're not really saying that it's not a religion. You're saying that the defining characteristic of the religion that is Christianity, or true, let's say, biblical Christianity, is about a relationship, a right relationship that you have with God. But that's something else. And so when you hear those kind of statements, just take them with a real grain of salt. Now, oftentimes people who say those are coming from right heart intentions, but it really doesn't. It's a nonsensical, non-starter kind of argument. So Christianity, Judaism, they're religions. And whenever we talk about, that should be obvious. I mean, sorry if you've held that. If you're in suspense on that point, they're religions. Black is still black and white is still white. Sky is blue and the grass is green. But I do think it's important to kind of challenge some of those assertions that are often made without any basis in reality. Now, the next question is then, how does the biblical text, and I'm specifically talking about the New Testament, what is the New Testament talking about when it's talking about religion or religiosity? I would say that Jesus often is referring to religiosity. To continue with our theme of the Sermon on the Mount, we can think of Jesus spending lots of time talking about how the scribes and Pharisees are outwardly religious, how they clean the outside of the cup, but the inside of the cup is full of wickedness. How he talks about how they constantly go into a ritual bath, even when they go into the marketplace, and they even bring their cups to go and be ritually washed, or like in Matthew 23, where he talks about how they wear their phylacteries, like this gentleman here, he's got a phylactery on his head, and his fringe is long. That's talking about the prayer shawl. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with those things. It's likely that Jesus wore a prayer shawl. It's likely the disciples did also, and perhaps also wore phylacteries. There's nothing, in fact, in his statement there in Matthew 23, it seems to indicate that wearing phylacteries in itself was something that everyone kind of did. But the point is that those who want to be seen as religious and overtly religious, who want to have the glory of man, they highlight and accentuate their religiosity. They, both in the physical, the long fringes, the broad phylacteries, as well as the showiness, bringing their spice rack to the Temple Mount to tithe out dill, mint, and cumin, or if we go back to the Sermon on the Mount, to wail on street corners and in marketplaces, which is also mentioned in Matthew 23, that to be seen by men. And Jesus says very clearly that if that's what you want, that's what you'll get. That's the glory of this of man, to receive man's glory. But that's not the righteousness that we are called to. That's not the glory that we're called to. And so to give the flip side of this, Jesus says, when you pray, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. When you pray, do so secretly, where your Father will hear you in secret, and he'll answer you there. And that is establishing this understanding of what religion means. It's often being in the Bible compared to these outward signs of righteousness that are not about the heart intentions. And so that's very much a part of what James is defining here and using this rare term for religion. But it's something Jesus often does, particularly in the synoptic gospels. And I would say because so much of James is tied to Matthew, we can think of it in Matthew 6 and somewhat Matthew 7 and again Matthew 23. And so when he uses these terms, he's bringing with, I'm talking about James here, who's piggybacking off Jesus in many of these statements, he's bringing it with it this image of these mitzvahot, these acts of righteousness that the Pharisaic tradition is telling the people of the land that they must do. They must follow these teachings of the law. And these are the things that Jesus is constantly criticizing these scribes and Pharisees for, because they've built around the heart of the law this thing that Jesus says is the greatest commandment is love God and love your neighbor as yourself, as well as these other moral teachings of the law. They built around it a fence to where in order to protect you from breaking the law, they've actually negated your ability to follow the law. Jesus says it another way. He says that you've nullified the word of God with your tradition. And so by following these traditions, they're attempting to actually fulfill the law, but they actually make it to where you cannot fulfill the law. And then we can go down another path that I don't want to spend too much time on, but even if we could, even if those traditions are not there, Paul is very clear in Galatians and Romans that the law itself, even pure and unbridled, cannot ultimately save us. It just shows us our sin. And it's this guardian that we're kept until we reach that full salvation. Christ finally comes and we have this ability to have faith in him as this justification by faith arrives. And so if we think again about this religion, he is implying strongly that those who are listening to him are religious. They are interested in his letter. By the fact that they're getting this letter from this church leader in Jerusalem, James, the preeminent church leader. They're opening it up, and they're interested to hear what he has to say about religion. And his teaching is therefore related to both their perception and what is ultimately the truth. And so the first thing he says again, if anyone thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his heart, this person's religion is worthless. Now, if we go to our next slide, we see an image that James is going to come back to. This idea of not being able to bridle your tongue is something directly tied to someone who is not really religious, someone who is not really devoted to God. And I think that's a good word, devoted. How much are we devoted to God? How much are we devoted in our heart, in the same sense that 1 Samuel 16 says that David is a man after God's own heart. He follows God no matter the cost to his person. Where Saul fails, David succeeds. How much are we devoted to our Lord? Well, one of the outward signs that James tells us is that we will be able to bridle our tongue. And I would say to us in this part 2 of the True Religion Works section is that if we go back to the beginning of this in verse 19, is that this is the bookend. Being slow to speak, quick to hear. That means that you are able to bridle your tongue. You're able to rein it in. We can even use that modern expression to think about these things deeply. Now, what can this mean? Well, this can mean a wide variety of things. This can mean that even when we are wronged, we don't lash out in anger. It can mean that when we're wrong, especially, we don't lash out. It can mean as a parent, taking the time to think about my words and my response, even when my child has done something incorrectly. How are my actions going to allow me to show Christ's love, Christ's justice, Christ's glory in this situation? This is therefore not just about the tongue. It's not just about what comes out. It's about the tension, the crisis that's going on inside of you as you are trying through the power of the Spirit to put to death the works of the flesh and the thoughts of the flesh through the Spirit that lives inside of you. And again, what comes out is so crucial because what comes out speaks to where your heart is. And again, if we think about the situation that we find ourselves in, we could not have a more apt advice for us in these days, really all days, but especially the time that we find ourselves in, and especially as our voice, even though we in many cases still can't talk to one another, we can't visit in many parts of the country now. And we're still in our churches restricted. It's not the sound of the voice, but the words on the screen, whether it's the 144, maybe they increased it now, characters in Twitter or your Facebook feed that you're sharing, so on. Bridle it. I'm not saying don't say anything. I'm just saying that matters. It matters about your the perception that you're putting out there. Anything that you do is a witness to the world and to those around you of who Christ is. And we definitely need to bridle this in. Now, again, Jesus and James spoke. Of course they did. They spoke with powerful words. We'll see later how James is going to give what is effectively like the Supreme Court majority decision in the Jerusalem Council, and how he's going to favor Paul and Barnabas's testimony on what they're to do with the Gentiles. But it's after thinking through all of the information and being gracious. And so we need to pay careful attention to that. Now, another aspect of this, besides bridling your tongue, is that if you don't bridle your tongue, you're deceiving your heart. Now, I mentioned this before, that this word heart is so critical in James. It's also tied to the soul. We talk about this with double-minded, being double-souled. You deceive your heart. That means you are not following the path that God has laid out for you, that you're wanting to follow your own way, or even the way of the evil one. So we can't deceive our heart. We need to think about these from God's perspective. And this is the last point. If you do that, your religion's worthless. And this fits in very nicely with what we have said earlier about outward signs of righteousness. Now, in the New Testament era, late Second Temple period, again, this is signs of righteousness. This is phylacteries, those prayer boxes. This is fringes. This is praying loud in the streets. And if you go to Israel today, you can see still these same images. But for us living in the West, for us living in the United States and other parts of the West, it's not exactly those things, but it is going to church. It is having our bumper sticker with maybe a Christian message, or the types of things we consume, or the political causes that we are behind. If we have all these outward signs of righteousness that seem to point to us being religious people, which aren't bad in of themselves, and we don't follow the fact that we have to bridle our tongue, all of that stuff's worthless. That's what James says. We have to follow this teaching. It's so crucial. And this is going to be something that comes back. He's going to spend several more verses down the line in the book talking about how the tongue can lead us down a path to great ruin and great destruction. And so with that, we'll leave this nice horse and get to this other section. And this is the section that I'd like to spend the most time on in our session today, because I think it's kind of like this is one of those great verses in the Bible. It's, as I've said, a verse that people remember. Oh yeah, James is that book that talks about how true religion is caring for orphans and widows in their desolation. Oh, and yeah, he says something about oil at the end that's kind of weird. That's what people may remember. They also remember in chapter 2 about the faith that works is dead. Now, leaving those two others aside, this stands as this altruism, this true for all time, this axiom of James that we almost immediately gravitate to and say, yeah, that's right. That's what it is to visit orphans and widows in their affliction, and of course, this other part that we often forget, to keep oneself unstained from the world. Now, I would like to say a couple things. First thing, before I forget, is I firmly believe that what James is saying here is rooted in two massive truths. One that is connected with the Old Testament, which we'll come back to, and two, one that is connected with Jesus. Now, Jesus never says what James says here, but his life is characterized by the care for orphans and widows. As I said before, Jesus makes these pronouncements when he's on the Temple Mount. He has one here. Let me go ahead and read it from Luke's account. Beware the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and love greetings in the marketplace and the best seats in the synagogues. Even in Matthew's account, it says seat of Moses. We actually have a seat found at Chorazin, one of the places that Jesus announced, and on it says Moses' seat. So these are real things. In the place of honor at feasts, who devour widows' houses and for a pretense make long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation. Now, what does that mean, devour widows' households? Well, actually, this precedes when the widow offers her 2 mites, her last 2 coins, in the temple. And Jesus makes a statement that she's given all she had. She's given more than you. Now, oftentimes that seems quite positive, but it's actually very negative. Jesus in that passage is denouncing this entire religious system that would allow for the widow and the fatherless to have to pay to support this religious system. He is against it completely. He's against this entire system, and his ministry is characterized again by caring for those who are on the outside, who are mistreated, who are persecuted by society. That's what Jesus does, and he is being therefore contrasted with those who would become wealthy off of the backs of those who are poor and feel compelled to give towards this cause. Now, I think there's a great parallel here, and it's often pointed to with the prosperity gospel, with the word of faith movement that's often doing this. It's going to places like poor parts of Africa and other parts of the world, or here in the U.S. also, and getting people to give to support these false aspects of religiosity. But there's also something for us here in our modern circumstance that we need to pay careful attention to. Now, before I get into this Old Testament passage where it says there in Psalm 146, I want us to also think about how this is tied into the Golden Rule, how this is tied into what Jesus is going to say is the great commandment, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself, or in the Golden Rule language, to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It's tied to it because of all those who you would do good to, of all those whom you would love, and you would pay careful attention to, of all those neighbors, especially those who don't have what is needed to survive, especially those who don't have what is needed to have the basic necessities of life, or the bare necessities, if you like the Jungle Book. These are the ones whom God has called us to pay careful attention to. Now, again, as we talk about this, there are so many things I know buzzing around your head. They're buzzing around my head. When we talk about this, we're talking about politics. Of course, we're talking about politics. We're talking about things like welfare and things like how the government reacts to the church, and how one particular politician thinks this way and one particular politician says this way. I would ask us to not shirk those responsibilities. We need to think through those logically, but at least in this lesson, let's think about what we're called to. We're called to care for the orphans and the widows in their affliction, which are those neighbors who most need that care. What is the church doing? Not blaming the government, not blaming someone else, but what is the church doing to do that? What are we doing as the church, as people and followers of the church? And so this is something that we have to constantly consider at the forefront. Maybe it is something that you are doing. Maybe it's something that you have thought through. But if it's not, it's something that we need to carefully consider. Who are these orphans and widows today? Who are these? Well, in fact, I don't really like the word orphans as much as I do like the word fatherless. Because in the ancient world, someone who's fatherless just simply means his father has died. It could mean that his mother is still alive. But to lack a father, to lack the person to work the land in what is essentially a subsistence level economy, which is patriarchal in nature, you've lost inheritance. Perhaps your inheritance is in jeopardy. Perhaps someone can defraud you at that time. And so it falls on the king to make sure that justice is reckoned, justice is given for those whom have no natural recourse, who have no protector in the kingdom. And let me point to Psalm 146, verse 9. This is not the only place this occurs. It's just a convenient one. It says, Yahweh watches over the sojourners. Sojourners are people who come into the land who are living there. They also don't have the land claim, the land title. They're there living off the mercy and grace of those who are around them. Often this is giving wheat and other products for them to survive. Then it says Yahweh upholds the widow and the fatherless, but the way of the wicked he brings to ruin. And so if we're seeing this as a characteristic of what true kingship is, kingship, of course, is government. What true kingship is that God, the ultimate king, Yahweh, the ultimate king, he does these things. He cares for those who cannot care for themselves. He is the one who does that. Well, this gets disseminated. This gets passed down in other places in the Old Testament to being attached particularly to kings. That kings, their responsibility, that they are empowered by God, by Yahweh, their personal God and the God of Israel, to make sure that this happens. And if they don't, it's a sign that they are a wicked and evil king. They are not doing justice. And so this is almost like the canary in the coal mine of justice in ancient Israel. If the widows and the orphans are not cared for, then there can be no justice, because they are the ones, along with the sojourners, whom must be cared for, because they are the ones who are the most vulnerable. We see the same thing show up in books like Hosea and Amos and parts of Isaiah that are so concerned with this social justice. And oftentimes we as Christians in America, living in a very wealthy society, many of us, and again, I'm not talking about comparative, I'm just saying to live in a society that is much wealthier than it was in the ancient world, it's easy for us to pass over these, to say, okay, the government has claimed that responsibility through programs, let them handle it. And that's not the way. That is not the way that the Old Testament suggests, and that's certainly not the way that Jesus's life and ministry was characterized by. He went out of his way to care for those. And let me just look at one example. This is a fun one. This is a look at the Hill of Moreh. Actually, excuse me, this is on the Hill of Moreh, looking at Mount Tabor. This is one of my favorite places on the earth. One of my favorite places to visit and think about the Old Testament, the New Testament passages that occurred in this area. Now, if we were there, I'd point out that just behind where we have this nice church, just on the other side of this hill, about 3 or 4 miles away, we have the site of Shunem. And here at Shunem, we have Elisha the prophet, who is going to raise a boy from the dead for a widow whom has come to him and pleaded with him because of the death of her boy. Well, Jesus does the same thing on the other side of the hill, which is just a cool thing, because Jesus is this wonderful prophet who cares for the widows, who cares for the fatherless, just like Elisha, except he's far better. And it says in Luke 7, soon afterward, he went to a town called Nain. That's where the church is here on this cool photo from the latter part of the 19th century. Even until today, it has this name. And his disciples and a great crowd went with him. As he drew near to the gate of the town, behold, a man who had died was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. Why does the Bible go out of its way? Why does Luke record this information? He records it, he highlights. He could have just said, kid died, his mother was sad. But it says specifically, she's a widow. Why is that significant? Because Jesus cares for the widows. He cares for the fatherless. And a considerable crowd from the town was with her. And when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her and said to her, do not weep. Then he came up and he touched the bier, the thing that the child was laid on. And the bearers stood still. And he said, young man, I say to you, arise. And the dead man sat up and began to speak. And Jesus gave him to his mother. And so this beautiful scene of Jesus through divine power, this miraculous scene of divine power, Jesus carries out because he has compassion. He has compassion on this woman. Not because he's necessarily motivated by other factors. The Bible says he is compassion. Now, we don't have, unless the Lord, and I don't think he will, based upon the scriptures, give us the ability to raise people from the dead like Jesus did. But we have the capacity and the command from James and from the Lord himself to care for widows and orphans and widows and fatherless among us. And I would say that beyond that, that goes to all around us, of those who are suffering, those who are in economic or dire straits that we need to pay careful attention to, that we need to reach, both with the message of the gospel, but also in many cases with just basic necessities, reaching them with the power of God's love. Now, this might sound like a weird one, but I want us to understand that this is not new. That the statement that true religion, or that in the context of a kingdom, in the context of a people in control, that the idea that the barometer, the thing that measures true justice, is to care for widows and the fatherless, goes all the way back, even before we have kings in Israel, even before we have the patriarchs. We have this statement made in ancient texts. This one I've chosen is from the 13th century to the 1200s BC, but it's not the earliest. We have these again in the 3rd millennium BC, where it is said that justice is not done because the widows and the orphans are not cared for. So one of the ways in which we can talk about common grace, Romans 1 language, one of the things in which God has revealed himself to the world, irrespective of his special revelation that he has given to us through Scripture, is this thing that we all know deep down, that those who are frail among us, those, especially again, these fatherless and widows, that they must be cared for. And if not, there's something very, very wrong. And so as we've looked at these situations, that should be something that is just really shining through. One of my favorite songwriters and musicians, Andrew Peterson, he tweeted out in a song many of you know, in the midst of all these protests and riots, he just said, do we feel the world is broken? It is. It is broken. It is broken. And one of the main ways we know that is because this is true, that widows' cases are not heard, that orphans are, that they're not cared for. And there's many ways for us to do that, and I'm not here to tell which way that should be. I'm just trying to point out that it's something we need to constantly and consistently be about. As Tony Evans was saying, and I appreciated his comments on many of this, is that we need to be those who are for justice from the tomb I got it wrong. Be for justice from the womb to the tomb, and all the way in between. That we are for justice. And again, this is something that we see now, something that we see in the time of Jesus, of course, everywhere in between, where we've had gross injustice at various times in our history. And then, of course, going all the way back, even before the Old Testament. Let me just read this text to you. This is about a king, really interesting king named Daniel, who is wanting a son. And this is towards the end of this tale. It's called the Epic of Akkad. And it says, Daniel, the man of Rapau, the valiant Harnamite man, arose and sat at the entrance to the city gate, among the leaders sitting at the threshing floor. So this is very common in the Old Testament, in this world, where the leader is seated at the threshing floor, which is often found near the gate, sitting at the gate. And even we have some of these thrones found, like a place like Tel Dan, where we have this gate with the throne beside it. We also have in 1 Kings 22, talks about how Ahab and Jehoshaphat are sitting at the gate trying to figure out what they're going to do, go to war. But it's the place where you often hear the trying of cases. It's exactly what we have in this text. It says, he judged the widow's case, made decisions regarding the orphan. And so even in a pagan Canaanite world, this is something that humans understood was right, that we must care for those. And so how much more so as followers of Jesus, and especially because we have it revealed in the Bible again and again in the Psalms and prophets, and of course reiterated through Jesus' ministry, and as James says it here, are we to do that? Well, I'd like us to transition to this last part of the sermon, this last part of chapter 1, because it's not just all about widows and orphans. He says that it's this social side, caring for those who are helpless, is very critical. But so is our character. So is our personal character in terms of how we are perceived by the world. And here he's talking about worldliness and the opposite of worldliness, holiness. And again, as I've said, oftentimes we get that first part. True and undefiled religion before God is this. Well, we don't add that and to keep oneself unstained from the world. But to James, this is so crucial. We have him saying later, James 4:4, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. We may have great philanthropists. We may have great people that are giving of themselves to care for the down and out, that are so concerned, and all that's good. But if they're living a life marked by gross sin, of personal sin, whether it's doing things illegal, whether it's promiscuous sex, or whatever it is, and we'll get to that list of things in a minute. It's still wrong, and it still disqualifies you from what true religion is. And for many of us, this is one of the greatest challenges, and this is really a challenge for everyone. How do we keep ourselves unstained from the world? And this is a question we won't be able to completely address in the time that we have. But there is something that is truly difficult to try and grasp, because we are part of this world. We are in this world. We are, in a sense, living in these bodies of flesh that Paul talks about. Yet our spirit has been made new. We are a new creature. We are a new creation. And this world is passing away around us, but it's still a world that we inhabit. And it's still, as he's just said, it's important that we do justice to those who have the lack of justice. And so at the same time, we have to keep our expectations and our hope upon our heavenly citizenship, on our citizenship in the city that is to come, to use Hebrews language, while at the same time realizing that we live in the here and now. So we have to affect positively the world around us with the message of hope, and of course the message of the gospel, and of course justice, as we've seen here, and yet not place our hope on the here and now. And so this is a difficult tension that we often have to keep in mind. But just like what we've said earlier with regards to the tongue, if our heart is marked by an allegiance to our Lord, it is something that we will do. It is something that we will feel compelled to do, because it is what he has called us to do. And just as an aside to this, we can think of Jesus also. Jesus experienced this. He was here for 30 some odd years, living in this flesh, knowing that it was not all about what he was doing then and now. The ultimate goal, the ultimate purpose was that cross and the empty tomb, that he was going to save this whole lost world. You know what? He still had compassion on that widow and orphan at Nain. He still had compassion on all all these other people and helped them and taught them. So we have to be able to both have our eyes on the prize of this heavenly reward, of this rule that's coming to us, to talk about it in Revelation, that we are going to sit on the throne with Jesus and with a rod of iron, and we're going to experience this new Eden and all of its glories and wonders. But that's not the only state we live in. We live in a state in the here and now. And just like Jesus, we have to both show compassion to those, but also keep ourselves unstained by the world, just as Jesus did. And so I'd like to point to this. I mentioned earlier that James gives the summary statement at the very important Jerusalem Council, which happens probably just a couple of years before the writing of the book of James. Many date the writing of the book of James to something like 47 or so AD, and that's right about the time that we have the Jerusalem Council, sometimes dated to about 45 AD. But so this is thought to be slightly later. And the language that we have in Acts, very interestingly, has some parallels to what we read in the book of James. So it really seems like Luke is a good recorder. Well, maybe we already knew that, but Luke is a good recorder of James's speech. And after this, and if you want, go to Acts 15 and read this Jerusalem Council. It's really an important text. James gives this. He says, "Therefore my judgment is that we should not trouble those of the Gentiles who turn to God, but should write to them to abstain from things polluted by idols, and from sexual immorality, and from what has been strangled, and from blood. For from ancient generations Moses has had in every city those who proclaim him, for he is read every Sabbath in the synagogues." I love that last line, because this is James saying that there has been this message that's gone out to the world even before, long before Jesus arrived, long before Jesus came and died and was rose from the dead, that this message of righteousness from Torah has been proclaimed in these various places throughout the Jewish diaspora. And so there's been a distinction between how Jews and Gentiles act already. And so the question is, what should be kept and what should be discarded? And the answer really is that the truth that Judaism had long spoken to, the truth that is in Torah, that we find in great statements like love the neighbor as yourself, love the Lord your God with all your heart, that has been now fulfilled in Jesus, allows you to actually fulfill all of what the law was intending you to do. And so one of the things that's common between the way Jews had acted in the past and the way that these Christians are now going to act, and that Jewish Christians and that Gentile Christians must act, is that they must be abstaining from the world. And he gives 3 examples. He says things polluted by idols, sexual morality, and strangled and with blood. Now, I won't spend too much time on strangled and blood and idols. I actually think those are all related. This refers to meat that is sacrificed to idols. Now, this is really an important part, because this is associated with the idea of allegiance, that you are to have allegiance to the Lord your God, that you're not to participate even tangentially in the consumption of meat sacrifice. That's what sacrifice actually is. It's feeding a pagan deity. We don't do that. Our allegiance is to God alone. So James says, I know that this is going to be something that's going to draw them away. And Paul talks about this later on. You can't participate in that, because if you do, you're falling back into that Old Testament sin of syncretism, of saying, I'm attaching this new God to stuff that I've had in the past. I'm going to cover all my bases. I'm going to be polytheistic, and it doesn't work. This will stain you in the world, because you are following worldly deities. You are following perhaps actual deities that are out there, actual pagan gods. You're following them instead of following God alone. So if you're following the creator God of Israel, that cannot be allowed. Old Testament, New Testament. He demands your whole allegiance. That's why we have the Shema. This is Deuteronomy 6:4. I've loved in the last couple of months, my oldest two are starting to quote this, and it's just so powerful when we are making this statement. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. This is not just a declarative statement about the identity of God. It's a statement of allegiance to him that is made every day by religious Jews, and something that we need to understand better as Christians, that our allegiance is to him and not these other pagan deities. Allegiance is so significant. And part of the allegiance too, besides just the direct conflict that often exists between pagan gods and the God of Scripture, is how we act internally. And that's why he puts these two together: sexual immorality and abstinence from idolatry. Now, in the ancient world, these were often tied together. We have, and it's disputed in the time of the Old Testament, but certainly in the time of the New Testament, we have ritual prostitution, sacred prostitution in some of these temples. But the idea of sexual morality is much more than that. It's not just this pagan worship and prostitution that happened. It's also any form of sexual morality, whether it's adultery or promiscuity or anything along those lines. And so to him, any of these things that are characteristic of Gentile pagan practice, and these two things are most definitely characteristic of Gentile pagan practice. Very common for Roman men and women to have many different sexual partners of both genders throughout their life, and particularly before they're married. It was a very common thing. So James is saying, this cannot be. Yes, we want Gentiles. Yes, it's clear now that God has turned his attention and he's going to save many in the world, that he's on the move, to use C.S. Lewis, Aslan is on the move. God is on the move in redeeming the world, in Acts language, to the ends of the earth. And yet that doesn't mean that we're drawing in this lack of holiness for those who are going to follow. You have to abstain. And so as we conclude this section and we look at it together, we see that it's a very compelling, very powerful argument that, as we've said, is marked by many of Jesus's teachings. I said before how we have this statement: be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. How this draws us into the way we think deeply about how we react and act according to Scripture. That we should not just only listen, but we actually have to do. And that's an important part to this too, is that it's not enough to just simply say, okay, I'm going to sit on the sidelines to this. I'm going to take this out. I'm going to take a break and not be involved because it's too controversial. This is where I really struggle. Knowing when to assert yourself, knowing when it is right to I'm slow to my anger, but then just let it slide. We can't let injustice slide. We can't let God's word be trampled on. We have to love our neighbor as ourselves. We have to follow this law of liberty that is greater than the law of Moses. That I really believe, as we've seen, is a law that is rooted in the new covenant. Jeremiah 31 language. It's the law of the conscience that Jesus talks about. Matthew 5, Matthew 6. That's a law that is deeper about your conscience attitude towards himself and towards others. And then these characteristics of how this plays out is that if you have true religion, that means it's not an outward sign. It's something where you're actually able to keep your tongue bridled. But it's also caring for those who are the least likely to get a fair shake in society, the widows and the orphans. And if we're bringing in Old Testament texts, this is sojourners as well. And so we need to look closely all the time at how we are missing the mark in that regard, and think about how we can be salt and light to those who are mistreated. And then finally here, is that we must keep ourselves unstained from the world. We must watch over our lives. We must live holy lives. And as we look at all of this, it's just so beautiful to think back and see Christ fulfilling and doing all of these things. And again, to borrow Hebrews language, if Christ has done it and he's made a new and living way for us, he has then given us the ability to do it ourselves. And so with that, let me just close then on this section of James. It's a powerful section. It's something that we need to pay careful attention to. We'll pick this up again in James chapter 2. We're going to be changing topics a little bit, but it's going to be talking about some of the implications of you might say the method or the purpose of what's behind holy living. He's going to be talking about those in chapter 2 as he talks about sins of favoritism and partiality, and eventually getting to this really crucial issue of how faith and works are meant to go together. We'll look at that next time.